Hello everyone, welcome to today's TechnologyCatalogue.com Mini Masterclass. I'm your host for today's Mini Masterclass and I'll be doing the introduction. The world has become a very scary place these days. A lot of businesses has changed the way that they are doing their day-to-day tasks due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And teams have to work virtually and from the distance. So this poses new challenges that they're facing. And today's webinar or mini masterclass is all about addressing those challenges. Allow me to introduce our guest speaker. With me today is Francis Norman, who is the General Manager of Strategy and Innovation at NERA. He completed a PhD in interpersonal communication in virtual teams, and he'll be giving us a presentation on the topic today. Before I hand it over to him, I'd like to raise 2 points. Number one is for audience to ask questions. They have the ability, you guys have the ability to ask questions. Please access the chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen to write your questions, and Francis will make sure to answer those questions at the end of his presentation. And the second point that I want to raise out is the ability for you to access today's presentation. I'll make sure the handouts to today's presentations is accessible via this platform during the Q&A session. I'll wait until Francis is done with his presentation. I'll make those files available to you guys. Having said that, without further ado, I will hand it over to Francis. Francis.
Well, thank you, Hamid. I'm never quite sure on these global platforms whether it should be good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. But it's great to have this opportunity to present on my, to present on my research, but also to talk about the relevance of my research when it's compared to the situation that a lot of organizations are finding themselves in now, which is moving from largely co-located, so everybody in one office, into an environment where everybody is working in multiple offices spread around their cities. Now, there are some slides here. Hamid, are you able to make the slides available, please? I'm not seeing them here. Oh, there we go, as if by magic. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a really quick description of who NERA are. So we're an industry growth centre. We're one of 6 industry growth centres that was established in Australia. We were established by the Federal Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, but we operate as a not-for-profit. So we work independently with the industry that we support. In our case, we work with Australia's energy resources sector, with the small, medium, large organisations, with the research institutions, with state, federal government, and really with anybody that has a challenge or an opportunity that's relevant to our sector. So we get involved in a lot of technology discussions, but we also get involved, particularly now, in helping these organisations that we support to navigate the landscape that they're in. Although we're all making this one. We're all trying to navigate this one along at the same time. So that's NERA, and that's who I represent. NERA has been involved with the Technology Catalogue now for about 1.5 years, and we supported the development of a portal for the catalogue into Australia. So why me, or why me for this particular exercise? My personal background, I refer to it as I used to be an engineer. I spent 30 years from 1983 working as an engineering manager, project manager in a large international EPCM organization, delivering major resource projects around the world for all sorts of different clients. 2010, after some very, very frustrating challenges with a particular virtual team that we were involved with, I decided that I really needed to know more about how these teams operated, because the one we had clearly wasn't working. We were having a lot of problems, and I embarked on a doctorate to examine, as the title there says, understanding interpersonal communications in virtual teams, which I completed late last year, and I had my fancy dress graduation here in Perth about 5 weeks ago. And boy, has the world changed in those intervening 5 weeks. We had we had no sense at that time here that we were going to see so much change. Now, and clearly, obviously, my research, while it's looking at big virtual teams and big projects, there are huge numbers of transferable findings from that, and it's really trying to share some of those findings to give people some prompts and some ideas that may help navigate that space themselves. That prompted me to deliver this webinar today. So the relevance, we've gone from lots and lots of businesses really being very comfortable and very happy working co-located. Everybody in a small office, medium office, large office, sometimes multiple offices around the world, but still offices where you've got many people who congregate day by day, 8 till 5, 9 till 4, whatever their standard hours are. We have certain social expectations that we're going to work with because we're in these environments together. We have certain things that we don't even need to talk about because we see people in this common space with us all the time. All of a sudden, over the last couple of weeks around the world, increasingly large numbers of organizations are transitioning from that co-located situation, which exposes their employees and their visitors to higher transfer risks for the COVID virus that's traveling around the globe. They're transitioning that from that position and that situation to one where lots and lots of their employees now are working individually from home. Now that movement from everybody in one big building or several big buildings to everybody scattered across a city or across a town or across a region is a major change to business environments. And it's a change that most organizations won't have experienced in the past. But it's a change which in many ways is extremely similar to what virtual teams have been navigating for themselves for probably the last 15 years or so, since the internet really got to the point where it was strong enough and stable enough to provide the support that was needed. So that's the relevance for what it is that I'm going to discuss. So there's really 8 key considerations that I'm going to work through, and then at the end of that, I think we'll be around about time for questions. And there are more bits and pieces in the handouts as well. There's some prompts and so sort of a bit of a check sheet that could be used when you're setting these things up. So technology, really, everyone gets excited about the technology. I get excited about the technology. I'm an engineer by background. I like to play with the technologies, but fundamentally in this space, the technology is only the start. It's the foundation, yes. If you don't have that foundation, then you can't build the rest of what you need to do. But it's the platform itself which is the enabler, not the platform which is the end goal. Lots and lots of organizations in the virtual team space, still their obsession is with brand X, brand Y, brand Z technology for this type of webinars or for this type of file share and so forth. Far, far, far less of a focus goes on to the people. So the things you really need to consider if you are moving, well, when you are moving, really, it's almost a default position now. When you are moving to a work from home environment, you need to be able to have server and shared access to software for your staff. Depends hugely on what your business does in terms of the strength of that network, the ways that you need to be able to manage that software, but you need to be able to do that. People need to have appropriate computing power at home. I was talking to someone in the city here last week. They were telling me that they'd done an inventory within their business, and they actually found that a lot of their employees didn't have a home computer. They had a tablet, they had a phone, but they didn't actually have a computer. So when we, by default, say, oh, well, can you use your own computer? Often people don't have that. So you need to find ways where, if necessary, you can provide them with that. They need an internet that is up to the job to carry the data loads that they need. They need a telephone. Again, a lot of houses these days are moving away from having landlines. They're moving towards people all being on mobiles. That has made it easier in some ways, but you still need to make sure that the mobile that your people have is appropriate for what you're trying to get to do with it. And then video conference. Now, video conference these days is practically free. It's thrown in, it's bundled in with a lot of packages that you have. You can get vanilla Skype, if you like, for nothing. You can get base entry Zoom for nothing. You get Microsoft Teams and lumped in with 365. So there are a lot of different options around for video conference, but still you need a camera, you need appropriate lighting, you need sound, you need everything else that goes with it if you choose to go down the path of video conferencing. But then you also need to work out what you don't have and how and where you're going to get it from, and then put it in place and provide your employees. Not everybody in your organization, for instance, will have the technical skills to set up all of this equipment at home. So some people may need people to travel to their homes or to give them some guidance over the phone to plug parts together and so forth. So that's the foundations for it. But as I say, that really is the bit that you get started with. Now, from my research, from my observations, from all the conversations I've had over the last decade while I've been investigating this, and from previous experiences as well, one of the absolute fundamentals for having your work from home, your virtual team environment function is the strength and the quality of the relationships. Relationships, typically, they're built up over time. In a co-located environment, you build up hopefully good relationships with the people that sit around you, with the people that you need to go and talk to in other parts of your organization. Those relationships rely on certain social interactions to maintain them and keep them going. And when you start to move from everyone being in one building where they can see each other at the coffee machine, they can see each other at lunch, they walk in and out of the buildings together where they can have quick catch-ups. When you go from that to an environment where people don't see each other, those relationships have to be maintained through completely different mechanisms of interaction. So people need to be much more frequent and flexible with their correspondence. They need to be able to have, let's say, less formal meetings and less formal discussions, just to make sure that they are keeping in touch with one another, that everybody knows that they've not been neglected, they've not been forgotten about. And it's quite easy. I found it in my research that a lot of companies would describe how they would have very formal set piece. Once a week, we have a project review type meetings, or twice a week, we have a project review meeting. We invite everybody into a telephone call or whatever. That works okay when all of those people at each end of that call are in the same space and they can actually then interact with each other. As soon as you start throwing people out into different buildings, that mechanism and that pace has to change. You have to go to a completely different sequence for your conversations, for your meetings. So the next part of that, which I touched on in the previous one, is trust. Fundamentally, if you don't trust your colleagues, if you don't trust your people who you can't see, your relationships are going to be under increasing strain. It's going to be harder and harder for your business to operate if your people don't trust each other. It's going to be extremely hard for your business to operate if your people don't trust you. Now, as far as trust goes, there are fundamentally three different styles. There's transactional trust, which is I've got on here, this person is good at their job, delivers reliably, therefore I will trust them. An exemplar of this might be that you've got a colleague who is working with you. You expect them to deliver you a certain piece of work by close of business on a Wednesday. If you get it at the quality you expect by close of business on the Wednesday, you will, by the nature of delivery, you will start to. Sorry, I've just had a bit of a disturbance there. My computer suddenly decided it was going to try and answer the phone. You will, if your transactional trust starts to break down, if people don't deliver on time, if they don't deliver to the right quality, then you are going to start to get that breakdown in that trust. So it's important that if you are delivering for somebody, you make sure that they know where you're at and what you've got going on. Similarly, if someone is delivering work for you, it's important that you stay in contact with them without micromanaging them to make sure that the work is coming along as you expected. So the second nature of trust in here, relational trust. This is more down to the fact that you actually like working with the person. And this is something that builds up a lot when you're co-located, but it's harder to maintain once you split across multiple locations. And fundamentally, a description of this one, this person's nice, I like to work with them, therefore I'll trust them. And you'll cut people a bit of slack because you like them. So it's a balancing thing between relational, transactional. The third one, which in my research was less common, but in the environment that we're in now actually may start to take on a greater significance, is what they refer to as in-group trust. And this is where the way it's described, this person's like me, we come from the same background, location, common experiences, therefore I will trust them. I think we're in an environment now where there is a potential for a higher level of trust simply because everybody is going through this same challenge of moving to what do we do with ourselves now we're moving into this this virus-driven working paradigm. So trust, fundamentally, you've got to work very hard to maintain trust, and you've got to actually give trust a lot freer maybe than you would normally do, because if you don't in this structure, then it will be very easy for things to start to go off the rails. Now, your communications, clearly communications is critical in this. The how and the when is a big part in a virtual team. Now, a lot of organizations, when they move from co-located to virtual to distributed teams to people working from home, from whatever, they essentially just take the same communication structure and model that they had when they were all in one building, and they just virtualize it. So they go from having one team meeting on a Monday morning where everyone turns up in a meeting room to having one team meeting on a Monday morning when everyone dials into whichever video platform or teleconference they may have. It doesn't work because once a week is infrequent enough. You don't get the opportunity to have those side conversations pre and post the meeting. By their very, very nature, these sorts of electronically mediated meetings tend to be very structured and very formalized. You really need to find different mechanisms, different paces and different structures for the meetings that will work for you. So you need to communicate often, you need to communicate openly, and you need to communicate honestly. This could mean that you go from once a week having a 1 hour call to having once a day having a 10 minutes, or having everyone check in every few hours, or whatever pace and structure works for you. You also need to be comfortable in having one-on-one discussions, telephone conversations, upwards and downwards and side to side through your organization, to make sure that everybody stays on the same page, everybody feels that they're involved in things that are going on, where they would, if they were co-located, they would feel that they were anyway, simply because they were part of the discussions. You've got to share the bad news as well as the good news. It's sometimes very easy to just say, oh, well, we won't tell anybody what the bad things are that are going on, but we will share the good things. People will be, if people don't hear anything, they'll assume the worst. So you may as well tell them. If the worst isn't as bad as they're going to assume, it will still come across to them as good news. So it's very important that you share openly good and bad. It might be by email to everybody, it might be by a call, it might be whatever mechanism works for your organization. It's also really good, if you're comfortable with it, to share a little bit of personal information. I mean, let's face it, once people start using video conference into their living room or their dining room or their kitchen or their spare bedroom or whatever, we're all going to see an awful lot of the inside of each other's houses that we wouldn't normally do. So you may as well share a little bit about what your pets are up to, what your family's up to, and so forth. Fourth point on there, assume the best of others. Now, it can be very easy in communications at distance to misread or miswrite particularly written communications. You might write, in all innocence, you might write a very quick, brief email in 2 minutes between doing two of the jobs. You hit send, the person at the other end receives it, they misunderstand it, and for the next 10 days or whatever, that person is avoiding you, or they don't know what to say to you, or they feel that they've done something to upset you or whatever. You've got as the recipient to assume that that was not the intent, and as the sender, you really need to take the time to ensure that what you're sending is to the best of your ability going to be interpreted clean when it gets received by the other end. Now, the fifth one on here is micromanagement. Micromanagement is very, very easy for a lot of us to drop into. It's very easy to when you can't see what someone else is doing, to assume they're not doing it. If you can't see that someone's working on your piece of work and you expect it at a certain time of day, it's very easy for you to start to micromanage, to be emailing, to be telephoning, to be asking them to send you versions of it to putting it on the server so you can look at it and check it and check it and check it. That is one of the best ways you can possibly go to destroy any environment of trust that you may have in your organization, because once you start down that micromanagement pathway, your staff will start to feel very, very uncomfortable with you, because they just won't know, just won't feel like they can relax. They won't feel like they can take any time out. They'll start to get more stressed. They'll start to disconnect. And you yourself will become increasingly stressed and wound up as well, because you're constantly testing yourself to see where you're at. Which brings us on to individuals. None of us know what is happening now in our colleagues, in our staff, and in our bosses' lives outside of what they tell us and what they share with us. We don't know whether they're dealing with elder parents who maybe are concerned where they're going to get their food from while they're locked away in their houses. We don't know if they've suddenly got 3 kids tearing around the house where before they were working in a lovely quiet environment in their office. We don't know if they've suddenly found that their partner is now working from home as well, and they're in some tiny little apartment. We have no idea and no sense of what their experiences are and what they're going through, unless they choose to tell us. Consequently, we need to be very supportive. We need to work very hard particularly in these difficult times, to be very, very supportive of our colleagues. And on that note, I would suggest that we also need to be very flexible over what times we expect people to work. There will be core meetings that you may want everybody to attend. You may have a video meeting at 9 o'clock on a Monday or Tuesday or a Wednesday or whatever. But do you then really need somebody who is trying to balance looking after their parents and looking after their children and supporting their spouse at the same time, trying to work a standard 9 to 5 hours day, simply because that was the standard day that they worked when they were in the office? So it would be very good for organizations, wherever possible, to explore opportunities to make sure, yes, the work still needs to be done, and I'm not questioning that in the slightest, but does it need to be done in that industrial revolution based standard attendance model, or can it be done at hours that work for the person doing the work, as long as they deliver on time? And through doing these sorts of things, providing that support and providing that assistance to your people will demonstrate to them your commitment to providing them with an environment in which they can do the work that they want to do, which takes some of the stress off their lives. They will then reciprocate that. All being well, they'll reciprocate back into the organization by sometimes going the extra mile. Some organizations that I've spoken to have been extremely apprehensive about going to work from home and flexible work policies, and yet they find as soon as they put it in place, the productivity in their organization actually goes up and not down. That people feel empowered because they're trusted to work in these different paces and different spaces. So it's very important that commitment is demonstrated in both directions. And some people may struggle with that commitment. Some people may struggle with adjusting to working from home, and they may need a bit of extra latitude, a bit of extra support along the way. Other people may dive straight into it, and it could become very, very quickly the default mode for some organizations into the future. Which brings me on nicely to organizational policies, procedures, norms, and so forth. I suspect a lot of organizations who are now moving to a work from home model will have a model in their policy system which basically says you can't work from home. They'll have rigid expectations around behavior, they'll have rigid expectations around what you can and can't do with company property, that you can't take computers off site, for instance, and yet your boss has just come along to you and said, oh, work from home, please take your computer and your keyboard and your mouse and everything home with you. So we need to make sure that we don't let the policies get in the way of what we're trying to achieve with our organizations. So either relax your policies, change your policies, put a very, very thin, lightweight policy over the top. Yes, you've got to maintain security on your systems and on your data and on your networks. You've got to do all those sorts of things. You want your reputation to be maintained and treated appropriately. You want your staff to behave in a professional and appropriate manner, whether they're working from home or whether they're working in the office, whether they're representing you anywhere. but you don't necessarily need to encumber them with all of the other documentation and so forth challenges that you have that go with it. Now, larger organizations, this is something for some consideration. Again, there's a big challenge for a lot of managers who are used to co-located work, that they want to be the hero. They want to be the superstar. They want to be the person who commands and controls everything that happens in their organization. And they want to be the center of everything. Once you start to break your team up into smaller and smaller units, and they don't get much smaller than everybody individually working from home, maintaining that rigid lines of communication and lines of leadership really is not sensible. You may want to start to look at breaking your command structure, if you like, within your organization down into a more devolved sense of leadership, or leadership structure, where you've got team leaders who control what's going on within their team, and then you may have sub-team leaders and so forth that are in there, where the leadership and the control and the communications go to being a much more organic and fluid and dynamic approach, rather than a heavily rigorous, everybody must report in a structured manner from the boss down over. So that, again, that's something for serious consideration as you move into this space. And then the final one of these, I think, is the back to the Superman model, if you like, for your managers and your project managers. The skills of a star manager or a star project manager in a co-located environment don't necessarily always transfer to working in a virtual team, in a distributed team. You have to be comfortable when you're leading people at distance. You have to be comfortable with it. That you may not always get a yes or a no, or a black or a white response to any question that you ask. It may always be a bit fluffy and vague. You can't just turn up at someone's desk and ask them a question. You've got to get a hold of them. You may have to send them an email. You may have to send them a text message. You might leave them a voicemail. They might be looking after a sick relative in hospital at the time when you try and call them. They're not going to want to respond instantly to a call from their boss. You've got to look at this devolved and shared leadership style. If your work involves checking and approvals, you may need to look at the workflow around checking and approval of work to make sure that it actually works in the new environment. Similarly, for some of the conversations and so forth that you may have. You may even need to give up some parts of the work and actually allocate them full time onto others. And a lot of these things that I'm describing here are not normally found in your typical alpha project manager or business manager, who tend to be very much a freak. Very much they want to run the business the way that they need and want to run the business. So those were the 8 primary themes I wanted to talk through. I'll really quickly, in the last couple of minutes here, go through some checklists and prompts. So the way I've structured this slide deck, the front half is very much what I've just been working through now. This back half is more wordy. It's got some prompts, it's got some questions in there for things that you may want to consider. So from a planning side, have you done anything like this before? Do you have people in your organization who at one point or another in their lives have had to go through some form of quickly deploying into a remote situation like this, whether that's going out to work remotely on a site, whether it's working from home for other reasons? Do you have people that have got that you can bring forwards with you? Have you got it elsewhere in your organization? Have you got it in your leadership and in your people? And if you have, where and how can you leverage that? Where will your people work? Do they have the right kinds of housing? How will the situation last? If someone is working from home for a few days and they're in a bed sit, that might work very well. If they've had to work from home for months in that same space, they may start to need some assistance in terms of maybe finding some other space that they can work out of, simply to maintain their own mental well-being. Look at different ways potentially about how you divide and allocate your work and how you manage the work as it goes out there. And if it starts to take longer and longer, work out how, where and when you'll undertake alignment. So in the project space, You would have relatively frequent alignment sessions to make sure everybody knows what everyone's up to and where everyone is at. You don't necessarily always do that in an ongoing business environment to the same frequency, but if this thing starts to run longer and longer, you may need to think about how you're going to do those sorts of things. What kinds of tools do we provide people for communications? Are they the right things? Not everybody, for instance, will want to communicate all the time on video. For some people in my own research, telephone and desktop sharing of documentation was all they wanted. They had no interest at all in video. Whereas for other people, video was their go-to first thing for the kinds of conversations and discussions they needed. So the tools need to fit the job in that regard. Do you need to change your structure? Do you need to look at your leadership approach? Do you have the right technical skills, communication skills? Do you have someone in your organization who can act as a coach to some of your people if they need it to some of these things? Who will make decisions? What happens if your manager or your boss, for whatever reason, is out of the loop for a period of time? Is there a fallback vehicle that you can use with it that doesn't revolve around them actually wet signing documentation, for instance? From an operational perspective, a few more questions. How do you, when and where do you hold meetings? I've covered a few of these things earlier on. As I say, this is very much just a checklist for consideration as you go forwards. Communications, pace and tempo, who should do what, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, weekly, monthly, quarterly. I really hope we don't get into multiple quarters of working from home, but who knows? You know, the world is changing by the minute at the present, and we need to see where it's all going to take us. So a few recommendations just to really quickly close these slides out. Fundamentally, the key thing, the key takeaway that I would give everybody from every time I talk about this is trust. Trust among your team and between your team and your leadership is absolutely critical to success in any kind of virtual team environment. If you don't trust your people and your people don't trust you, then you will be struggling to make any kind of progress with it. And that is something that is fundamental right the way through. And then as we get into these very testing, very difficult times, your people need to know that your organization will help them. Your people need to know that your organization will help them with everything. Well, sorry, with things sometimes that are not necessarily their day job and what they've got to do on a day-by-day basis. So if you want to follow up on any of this, if you want to talk to me, these are my contact details. I've got 2 different email addresses on there. I've got a Twitter handle. I am on LinkedIn if you want to stalk me on there. I've been writing and talking about this through my own little consulting business for a long time now. There's a lot of posts, a lot of articles on there. A lot of them were written specifically around large project virtual teams, but this last little few I've started to look at where we are with these this quickly moving from home. So that was that. I guess there are some questions, if I can work out how to get the questions up on here.
Thank you, Francis.
Yeah.
Yes, we got a few questions coming in, and I also make today's presentation available to our audience. I've just shared that on the files feature on the right-hand side. You can access Francis's presentation. Francis, the first questions was from Joop. Joop asked a few questions, but probably we can start from the question that he was asked with respect to internet speed. I read out the question. Which internet speed would you recommend as minimum for comfortable working from home?
Oh, heavens. Depends what you want to do. Hardware is not my key space in this, but you need stability. You need, I would say, definitely something beyond dial-up. ADSL, if that's the right terminology, different parts of the world talk about these things in different ways. Broadband would be probably a base point I would be looking for if you can find it. But look, if you've got people who are living in very remote locations where they need to log on and download something periodically, they can probably get away with that. You just shouldn't expect that people who are in that kind of space will be able to participate in video meetings, for instance, because video doesn't work on those very low speeds.
Great. And the next question again, Joop has asked a question about your recommendations. What would you recommend? Which recommendations do you have to maintain, boost, or repair relationships if you're confined to home working?
Communicate as much as possible. To establish in the first place, do it like you would except in a virtual sense. If you were meeting someone for the first time, if you were building a business relationship, you would want to go. You might go for coffee. You might have a go to an office for a meeting. You'd have a lot of conversations. You'd build it up over time. You'd share common experiences, and thereafter, once that beginning is in place, it's a case of maintaining it through frequent communications, but not going to the point where it feels like you're being stalked or why you're stalking someone else. So it's a balance, but fundamentally it's frequency and it's openness in any communications that you have with anybody that you're trying to build any kind of a relationship with. And yeah, start out professionally, clearly. Don't just start off by sharing pictures of your dog or your cat or your kids or your boat or whatever it may be, unless that is what it is that you actually want to talk to people about. Okay,
great. Thanks for that. And I take the question from Tim. He said, are there relationships established before or after virtual teams?
Both. If you were used to working next to people or with people in a building, if you're used to working with people co-located in an office, then those relationships you would hope would be pre-existing. And then as you migrate from that into a distributed situation where everybody's working from home, then you really should be able to carry those relationships forwards. But as time goes along, we're going to find new hires will be joining organizations, and their first period working with that organization is going to be working in their house alongside of other people working in their own houses. And for those people, those relationships are going to start from the day they join. Where you may choose to introduce them on a video chat, for instance, to introduce them to the team, and then as a team, you have to work out ways to build those relationships up with those people. So it's going to be very, very fluid and very contextual and dynamic, but take your time with it. Don't try and force things. Same as any kind of relationship. They all take time and they all take care and nurturing. So it's both, I guess. There you go.
Thank you. Next question. Francis, any tips for boosting relational trust while working remotely?
Be honest. Be honest. Be open. Be clear with people. If you're the recipient of a message and you look at it, you think, "Oh, I don't like the look of that one. What does this mean?" Go back to the other person, but go back to them in a way that doesn't immediately sort of punch them in the throat with your response. Go back to them with can you clarify it? Can you tell me what this means? Give them a call, whatever feels appropriate. Assume that they're there to start with. Don't assume that you're coming from a position of distrust, because that can be quite destructive. So try and assume that you're going in from a trusting position, and assume that people want to trust you the same as you want to trust them. But then, as I talked a couple of times during the presentation, there are things like micromanagement. If you're not careful as a line manager, particularly when you start to move into an unusual environment, it can be very easy to start to get very tense and very stressed because you can't see the work happening, you can't see your people doing the work for you. it's very easy to lapse into that micromanagement space, and that is a really, really bad environment to be in from a trust perspective, because you're essentially saying to everybody, by micromanaging them, I don't trust you. I don't trust what you're doing. I don't trust that you're going to deliver this work for me on time. So if you're doing the work, be honest, be open, give people regular updates. If you want to, share versions of whatever it is you're working along the way. And if you are the other side of that, try and keep your hands in your pockets from time to time, rather than banging away on the keyboard and sending everyone messages all the time.
Perfect, thank you. Next question from Cam. Any thoughts on using wearables or mobility devices to connect frontline workers to the folks in their homes?
That's a very good question. There are some very clever wearables around now, and I think if you can navigate the privacy concerns that some people justifiably have with wearables, that they can feel a little bit like they're being. It's not that you're looking at you. It's not that they don't necessarily always feel that you're doing this for their well-being. Sometimes some people will be suspicious, and they'll feel that you're doing it because you're monitoring their performance. But I think in this, particularly in the space that we're in now, where so many people are scattered around the place, there is probably a very good case for some sort of wearables, particularly if you've got, in the family sense, but maybe if you've got elderly relatives and you're concerned about them, you can't necessarily always just go around and knock on the door. If you can see where they are and what they're doing in their house. From a frontline worker to back to the office, I think there's probably a very, very good argument to be made that in this particular situation, they should be explored and explored deeply. That's a great question. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next question from Yop again. I know that some people are not very comfortable to talk over the phone. Would it help to call these people in return to keep the connection with them? Any tips? Absolutely,
yeah. Some people are, and some of it is cultural, some of it is just introvert, extrovert. Some people just are uncomfortable to pick up the phone and ring anybody. And yet those same people are sometimes people who really need that conversation and that connection to the organization to provide them with a sense of belonging. Absolutely, pick up the phone, give them a call, send them a text message. Sometimes text messaging can be a lot less confrontational if it's worded right. You can use little emojis in there. You can have groups on Snapchat. You can have groups on all the different little platforms that are out there. And those text messages sometimes could just be, hey, how are you doing? Everything going all right? How's the family? Have you got 5 minutes for a quick phone call? Anything like that. So people don't feel as confronted with it. But yeah, anything that softens the communications is definitely worth exploring. Within our organization, we've initiated something where each morning not everybody manages to remember to do this, but each morning we've asked that everybody just puts a quick message on Microsoft Teams. Just, I'm here. This is what I'm doing. This is what I've got going on in my day. So it's just a way of softening some of those relationships so that people feel less intimidated to actually start having some of those conversations. But great questions. These questions are awesome. Really are great. Thank you.
Great, thanks. We got many more actually. The next one, I read it out loud again. With virtual teams, are there techniques to capture nonverbal written signals from the team members?
Sorry, could you just go through that one again, please?
Yeah, sure. With virtual teams, are there techniques to capture nonverbal written signals from the team members?
Look, I think there's ways you can have various chats running in these sorts of meetings. But I'm assuming what you're talking about here is the sorts of things that you would pick up within a meeting if it was a face-to-face meeting where you'd have body language, that kind of thing, where you'd look at someone and they would be looking away, they'd be looking down, they'd have their arms crossed, they'd be, the closed posture, open posture, defensive posture sorts of things. Something to be conscious of on a lot of this correspondence and a lot of these discussions is really around whether people engage or not, whether people are, if you're having a video chat, for instance, I would always encourage, if you're having a video, that everybody should have their video turned on. It should be all in or nobody in, unless there are some people for technological reasons who can't. If people suddenly stop being visible in those sorts of meetings, then you can start to think, oh, there's something not quite right there. Either they don't agree with what's going on, or they've got a different opinion. And again, back to cultures, there are a number of cultures, and backing into a lot of my my specific virtual teams research, people from whose first language isn't necessarily the language in which the meeting is being held will often be reluctant to say things. They may be uncomfortable with their language skills. They may be embarrassed with their language skills. They maybe have a cultural thing where they just don't speak up in meetings. But those same people, if you had a one-on-one conversation with them, would often open up and share all of their concerns. So sometimes talk to people if you're aware that they're going to be uncomfortable. Talk to them before the meeting, get their views. And then in the meeting, don't point to them and say, oh, and by the way, you told me this. You use it as, what about this, as a general question, or I've been thinking about maybe, what as a group, what do you think about this idea or that idea? So don't put people on the spot either when you're doing these sorts of things. So be very aware and try and be empathetic really with people as you work through it.
Great, thank you. Next question from Job. What are the 3 largest pitfalls when working from home? Which items do we need to be most careful for?
Becoming isolated from the team and from the group. You may say to yourself, oh, I'm busy today, I won't bother emailing and bringing my colleague today, I'll leave it till tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes and you're busy, and the day after comes and you're busy. Before you know it, a week's passed and you haven't spoken to anybody in your organization, and no one's noticed that you've dropped off the grid, for want of a better expression. For me, that will be the biggest risk, that from the individual's perspective, that you accidentally, through being busy and being maybe uncomfortable in picking up the phone, you suddenly find that you are completely socially isolated from your organization. From the other way in, from the outside looking in, marginalization, where you may have discussions where you have half the team on a call and 2 or 3 people not, or you may have a call where someone has to leave and go off to another call, and the people that are left continue the discussion. And in doing so, a decision is made which leaves somebody feeling lost and that they weren't part of the decisions that it went along. A third one, oh dear. The third ones are probably going to start to become more at the personal level, where people feel stressed around expectations of delivery, while at the moment they're still trying to manage their personal stress of just dealing with everything that's going on in the medical environment around us all. And that builds up and starts to become an increasingly high level of stress for them within their organization, within themselves, that you've got an expectation that you maybe need to test with your colleagues and your manager around delivering work, while at the same time you're trying to juggle having suddenly your kids at home, suddenly you've got your partners at home, you've got your parents that you're trying to get food to. That, I think, would be probably my third. There's no particular order on those 3, but that'd probably be the third one that would come to mind.
Thank you, Francis. John asked the question, is there anything you can say about time of meetings or one-on-ones in a structure of the working day?
Be flexible. I think there is merit in aiming for a regular meeting, maybe once a week or twice a week, where you get as many people as possible in that common meeting. But beyond that, I would say try and be flexible. And as more and more people find that they've got their kids at home and they've got other pressures, try not to do it at lunchtimes, try not to do it when it's getting toward those points of day where you need to be, as a parent, you need to be paying particular attention to your family rather than particular attention to what you've got going on at work. So it's probably going to be those key core hours of, let's say, between 9:30 and then about 1:30 and 4 or something like that, where you would want to look at having meetings and having conversations. The times around that, the earlier parts of the morning, the later parts of the afternoon, the time around lunch, I feel as we get more and more people in that enforced work from home, they're going to need to find ways to balance their time. And it may be a normal working day may become 9:30 till 12, and then 1:30 till 3:30, and then 7 till 9. That might be, that might be the sort of working pace that some families and some people may find they need to move to. So I think just be conscious of other people's availability and their own personal demands and expectations on their time.
Great, thanks. Next questions from David. Is there not any need for live meetings to make working remotely as a team a success?
Yes, you need meetings. Absolutely. I think I would say you always need to have some form of a live meeting. You need to have them reasonably frequently, but they don't necessarily have to be the same kinds of meetings. Now, this is unless when you say a live meeting, if you actually mean face-to-face, then no, you don't. The electronically mediated technologies that we've got now will allow us for at least reasonably long periods of time to move to work completely remotely. If we get to the point where people have been socially distancing and working from home for 2 or 3 months, at that point, if the medical advisories will allow it, then I think people should start to explore ways to actually get back together again from time to time, just for a more relaxed social interaction. But beyond that, the digital technologies that we've got will allow a near enough sense of a virtual engagement without feeling that we need to keep going back to face-to-face meetings. Okay.
Great. I'm gonna be basically kind of skimming over a few kind of comments there that I don't know if they're questions or like barely just comments.
Yep.
I'll take Scott's question. The question says, do you think that there are limitations to what virtual teams can deliver? For example, complex projects may require face-to-face engagement to develop a scope and review deeply technical information. Other than occasional work from home for team members, at what point does virtual team become inappropriate for certain types of work? Where do we draw the line?
Well, look, my doctoral research was in virtual teams in large, complex engineering projects. I can't disclose the names of the actual projects or the companies that I did my research within, but the research itself was on and in projects that were being done for the West Australian resources sector back 8 years ago. And at that point, we had something like $200 billion worth of major resource projects being undertaken here. So from a traditional virtual teams, and it sounds really weird now to be calling them traditional virtual teams, but from a virtual team sense where you've got large teams of people working in co-located nodes, it can be done, but you need to really be careful over how you manage those relationships and how you manage the connections between people. How efficiently it can be done when you are in the kind of environment that we're in now, that's untested waters. And I think my gut feel would be that yes, it can be done, and it would be a very, very big but. Some of the research that I got out from my doctorate, for instance, would indicate that you need to look at very, very different ways for how you produce your estimates and your schedules and your scope split and your risk management plans and your travel requirements and all those sorts of things. Just to move from a major project being undertaken in a co-located space to one being undertaken by maybe 3 or 4 large virtual team nodes, to move from that into a completely work from home, essentially, I don't know, 1,000 different people all working from individual locations, you would need to be extremely careful over how you managed your risk allocations and your risk profile within the work. You'd need to be extremely careful over how you put together your schedule and your budgets and so forth, because the exposure to things slipping would be much, much, much higher in that space than they would be if you were doing it in a more conventional virtual team. So yes, but.
Thanks for that answer, Francis. Last question. We're kind of running out of time here, so I'll stick to this one as the last one. Klaus asked the question: if the virtual team members are from different culture, backgrounds, language, what needs to be considered?
All of that. As you start to move into teams with different cultures, with different languages, you need to be very, very conscious and aware of how the cultures and the language abilities will influence the way that people will interact, the ways that people will communicate their expectations from and within the team and within the project. You also need to look at it, I believe, from the sense that you need to understand that you've got different dynamics in different situations. So in Australia, for instance, we are incredibly multicultural. We've got people here from all over the world, lots of different languages spoken, but our base language is English, and the great majority of people that you would encounter in the workplace, their English is to a very high standard. Other parts of the world, you will have very high monocultural situations where everybody is from an other culture. So you need to look when you say, okay, what's standard Australian culture? There isn't such a thing, because the standard Australian culture is made up of 100 different cultures that are all blended together, whereas the standard Indian culture or Chinese culture and so forth is, while I would still never say there is a standard, there is at least a lot more sort of coming together toward a common point. So you need to be extremely careful with language. You need to be very careful if it's people who speak another language by first or second or third language, maybe your project or your work. You need to make sure that they fully understand what you're saying and you fully understand what they're saying. And that might mean that a conversation that would normally take 2 minutes takes 10. You may need to go in writing, or you may need to go verbally, or you may need to work through an interpreter sometimes. And then there are additional challenges if you start to get into documentation produced in second languages and how you work with standards in second and third languages, which are probably beyond the scope of this webinar, I think. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Francis. I saw a last minute question just come up. I think we'll do our best to perhaps take it 1 minute answer. That would be great. Yep. Alison asked the question, legally, how does working from home impact our liability as an employer? Oh,
you'd have to ask a lawyer on that one. I really, that's my short answer. I really don't know. But you would definitely want to test that. But I would say my recommendations when you talk to any lawyer is their job is to provide you with advice to keep you out of trouble, not necessarily to provide you with a black and white position. So I would test it with a lawyer. I think at the moment that sort of thing will be getting discussed in lots and lots and lots of company organizations around the place. Fundamentally, you need to make sure that the people who are working for you in their homes have the right insurance, and that your insurance will cover, your business insurance will cover them working there. Their household insurance perhaps may need to cover them for working from home. But I'm not a lawyer, so I'll put a big disclaimer over my head on that particular one. But good question, though, Alison. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Francis. I just want to point out to our audience that we'll be closing this webinar mini masterclass soon. So Francis's information is on the screen now. If you have any question, I guess you can basically contact him directly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I hope everyone enjoyed the basically presentation today. One more thing before I let everybody go, I want to let you know that during this time that we have social distancing, perhaps a good way of staying connected is through the webinars. Please make sure to check technologycatalog.com webinar page. We basically have the recording of today's webinar there, and our past webinars are available there, and you can see the schedule for the next upcoming webinars. Next week we have a webinar on robotics in maintenance. That could be an interesting topic. So please check our platform again, technologycatalog.com, and the webinar page, and check out what's coming up next. Thanks again for today's participation. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you, Francis, once again for a great presentation and Q&A session. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for your time. I've really enjoyed this. It's been great.